So in Islam, you have two foundational texts that both trace back to the Prophet Muhammad. But what's really fascinating is that the Quran and the Hadith have these incredibly different histories. Today on The Explainer, we're going to unpack how their journeys from revelation to the written page were just worlds apart. Okay, to really get this, we've got to start with one key difference that basically sets the stage for everything else. See, in a lot of religious traditions, scriptures are considered divinely inspired. God kind of guides a human author, but the author still has their own voice. The claim for the Quran is totally different. It's seen as divine dictation, the direct, unfiltered, word-for-word speech of God with no human author in between. And this whole idea is built on a really powerful concept called Tanzīl. This is the core belief that the text is a perfect, flawless sending down from God to the prophet. And because of this, the text is seen as inherently inerrant, which, as you can imagine, frames the entire way you'd think about preserving it. So let's jump into our first track, the Quran. The story here isn't as simple as someone just writing down a book. It's really a story about how a diverse, living tradition was forged into one single, uniform text and often happened in moments of real crisis. So picture this. The prophet passes away in 632, and in just a couple of decades, the Islamic empire is exploding across the map. This incredible growth leads to a huge problem. People in different parts of the empire are reciting the Quran with slight variations, and this is causing disputes. So, around the year 650, the third caliph, Uthman, decides he has to step in. But here's the kicker. Not everyone was on board with this standardization plan. In fact, some of the prophet's closest and most respected companions, like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, actually resisted it. He famously told his followers, "Hold fast to your codices." Basically, stick with the version you know. And you might be asking, why the pushback? Well, we're not talking about a few spelling mistakes here. There were literally hundreds of documented differences, variant readings, between manuscripts like the one Ibn Masud used and the new official version. It tells you that the early tradition had some real diversity to it. So the caliph made a bold, and you could say a political move. To create unity and stability, he ordered that all competing versions of the Quran be found and destroyed. This was the moment that a tradition with multiple variants was transformed into the single, uniform text that we know today. All right, now let's switch gears and talk about the Hadith. These are the records of the prophet's sayings and actions, and their story is a completely different kind of challenge. The goal wasn't to standardize one text. It was more like a massive detective story, trying to find the prophet's authentic voice in a sea of, well, a lot of noise. You see, with the Hadith, the problem wasn't different versions of the same text. Oh no. The problem was a massive flood of complete fakes. Different political groups, different legal schools, they all wanted the prophet's authority on their side, so they would just invent sayings and attribute them to him. So how do you even begin to deal with that? Well, early Islamic scholars came up with this really brilliant two-part verification system. It was this incredibly sophisticated form of historical criticism designed to sort the real reports from the fake ones. First up, they would scrutinize the Isnād. That's the chain of transmission, the list of people who pass the story down, generation by generation. Think of them like historical detectives. They'd investigate every single person in that chain. Was this person trustworthy? Did they have a good memory? Did they even live at the same time as the person they claimed to hear the story from? If any link in the chain was weak, the whole report was out. Okay, so let's say the chain of people checked out. They weren't done. Next, they'd analyze the Matn. That's the actual content of the report itself. Even if the chain was solid gold, if the report said something that contradicted the Quran, or a known historical fact, or just plain common sense, it would be rejected. But, fast forward to the modern era, and a whole new set of academic tools comes into play. Scholars started using what's called the historical critical method, and they began asking some pretty radical questions about both of these traditional stories. When it came to the Quran, some revisionist scholars, most famously John Wansbrough, threw a real curveball. They argued that the Quran wasn't actually finalized in the 7th century at all. They proposed that it evolved over a much longer time and only took its final form centuries later, in the 9th century. And for the Hadith, the new theory was maybe even more of a bombshell. A scholar named Joseph Schacht came along and argued that those chains of transmission, the Isnāds, didn't actually grow forward from the prophet's time. He said they were fabricated backwards from a later date. His big piece of evidence was what he called the common link argument. He noticed that for a ton of these reports, the chain of narrators would go back, and then suddenly, all the lines would converge on one single guy who lived a century or more after the prophet. Schacht's conclusion? That common link was probably the real source of the saying, and the entire chain before him was likely invented just to give it the authority of the prophet. So where does all of this leave us? You've got the traditional story, and then these really radical modern theories. Well, as you'd expect, in the decades since, things have gotten a lot more nuanced. The academic consensus today is somewhere in the middle. For the Qur'an, most scholars today don't really buy the 9th century origin story. The big problem with that theory? Just think about it. The empire was massive by then. The idea that you could introduce or create its foundational holy book 200 years late across that vast territory without anyone noticing or writing about it, it just doesn't seem plausible. Manuscript evidence keeps pointing back to a 7th century origin, even with all that early diversity. And what about Schacht's theory on the Hadith? Well, his insights are still super influential, especially when it comes to legal reports. But that idea that basically everything was fake, most scholars now think that goes a little too far. More recent research has actually found pretty good evidence for some early traditions, making the picture a lot more complex than total skepticism allows. And this all brings us to a really neat summary of where most modern scholars land. For the Qur'an, they see a text that does have its origins in the 7th century, but its perfect uniformity wasn't a given. It was the result of a deliberate political project. And for the Hadith, they see a vast literature that is less a perfect snapshot of the 7th century and more an invaluable window into the incredible intellectual and legal debates that were raging in the 8th and 9th centuries. So why does any of this matter? Well, it's because you can't really understand the evolution of Islamic law, its theology, or its entire civilization without getting a handle on how these two foundational texts came to be. The story of the text is the story of the faith. And that leaves us with a bigger question to chew on, one that applies to pretty much any sacred text. How does grappling with the messy, complex, and very human journey of a text, its collection, its debates, its standardization, how does that shape our understanding of its divine message?